Great. That you can see my slide, I guess?
Yeah.
And you can see me?
And we can see you, yeah. Yeah, we got the sun up briefly.
Great. All right, well, thank you. Thank you for having me today. Thank you, SERI. Thank you, University of Saskatchewan, Andrew, Marcia. I should probably also thank some of this research was funded by the Animal Society Institute, and some of it is currently being funded by the Culture and Animals Foundation and Canisius College. So I should thank all those people. This is nice to be here, and I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about my research. I have three main points that I'd like to kind of cover today. The first is to give you a bit of a background in my work, in who I am and in my work, and how it is that I came to the topic that I continue to be interested in. And then I'll spend the most of my time talking about research trajectories and different ways that this research has kind of manifested itself, some of the methodology that I use, and some of the areas that I focused my attention. And then I will briefly, I guess, touch upon some of the implications of the work as I see it, I guess. A little bit about me. Oh, and I wanted to also sort of point out that there's two kind of general guiding questions that I think I'd like to cover today, whether I cover that in my presentation or whether we cover that in the Q&A. And the first is to think about what it's like for children to experience the death or loss of a non-human being. And this question, for me, is kind of a phenomenological question, asking about experience, asking about sort of the structures of experience, the existentials of experience. I draw that from Max Van Manen's work around pedagogy. And then the second guiding question is to think about the role of experiences with death, loss, and grief in terms of children's understanding and meaning-making and sense of relationship to the wider, more than human world. And that's kind of the hermeneutic, interpretative component of my research. And so I generally kind of, even though I'm a mixed method, kind of qualitative generalist, interdisciplinary person, I generally borrow from phenomenological hermeneutics in order to conduct my research. So I'll talk a little bit about that too. Just a note on my own background and how I came to this work. This is the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And in the background you can see a lamb, the Lamb of God. I grew up Catholic. I grew up in Buffalo, New York, where I now work, even though I live still in Canada. I live in Fort Erie, Ontario. And I think being raised Catholic, going to Catholic school my whole life, played an important role in terms of my academic interest. I grew up in a family that was pretty open to me spending time outdoors and encouraged my interest in animals. But, we went to church and learned about the end of the world. And I think there was a time in my childhood, a sense of, when I learned about animals, whether that was through media or in school or through environmental programs, there were often themes about endangered species and ecological degradation and sort of largely negative themes. And I began to sort of attribute these, for some reason, to my growing fear in my childhood of the apocalypse, which I laugh about now, so it's okay to laugh about that. But I was really worried about the apocalypse, Judgment Day. I was worried about animals and the natural world, and I saw this all just kind of wrapped up together. And so there is probably this subconscious obsession with death and loss and grief to begin with that comes from my own background. But I also came to this topic sort of professionally as an environmental educator. I've spent about 15 years now in various capacities working with children. As a curriculum developer, I worked for a while with a few nonprofits in and around the New York City area. teaching children about the environment. I worked with the Bronx Zoo, teaching kids about animals and endangered species and extinction, climate change, all kinds of negative themes around death, loss, and threats. And so issues of environment and issues related to animals were sometimes scientific and biological, but they were often tied to these larger narratives of degradation and loss. And I began to wonder about what it meant to teach children within this kind of a framework, to teach them that the natural world is something that we are losing, or to teach them that animals are becoming increasingly rare. And when I went and started my PhD research, I guess I was sort of confronted with what it is that I wanted to do my research on. And I began to reflect on my experiences, and this theme kind of returned again and again. And so my research built on this idea of the specter of death, on death's existential significance, on its centrality in various curricular spaces, and on the experiential quality of death and loss as vital phenomena in our multi-species communities and in our world. One author that I've begun to pull from in this work, especially lately, is Deborah Berg Rose, who wrote, "What is happening to other creatures in this era of mass anthropogenic death may be too large to think, too unprecedented to know how to imagine." And I came to this, a lot of her work actually at the very end of my PhD research, but she writes a lot about ecological existentialism, the role that human beings have in eradicating other species, and what that means for our larger sort of ecological world. Ethically, she writes about losing sort of temporalities in the universe. Every time species are lost, we lose a sort of perspective on the world. And so I was drawn to this idea of some of the existential components of these large institutional and structural ways in which human beings have been the sort of harbingers of death and extinction across the globe. So a bit about what then is happening. And some statistics I think that may or may not actually help us understand anthropogenic mass death as she articulates it. So I'm providing some numbers on Canada and the United States, partly because I do research in both places. And the United States has much higher numbers, so there's more shock value, which is always good. There's 40,000 to 50,000 cats, dogs euthanized annually in Canada versus 2.7 million euthanized annually in the United States. These numbers generally are decreasing, but not in any significant way. And these are sort of average numbers. Even though more and more people in both countries are now inviting companion animals into their homes, problems with strays, problems with feral animals still exist in huge numbers. And so we have sort of manufactured death in various ways through shelters, through pounds, often animals that, cannot be adopted out or unfortunately euthanized. And this doesn't even take into account feral animals that die daily because they cannot survive wherever they are. In terms of the sort of animal livestock industry, I suppose, the numbers are significantly higher. 650 million animals are slaughtered generally each year in Canada. And in 2014, about 9 billion animals were slaughtered for consumption. We're also in the midst of what's being called the Holocene extinction. The Holocene extinction has become what is known as the 6th largest mass extinction event in history, although the first that can arguably be attributed to one particular species and its impact on the ecosystem. And so statistics on extinction rates actually really range widely, but there's significant whether you consider the low end, which is about 200 species lost per year, or the high end, which is as many as 100,000 species lost per year. Those numbers are really significant, and those are actually increasing along with human population growth. And these aren't really total numbers. I mean, there's numbers of lab animals that have been killed and animals that are killed as roadkill. There's all kinds of animals that we could talk about when we talk about mass anthropogenic deaths, but these are the ones that I'm just giving you some statistics on. I'm not going to really talk much about the Anthropocene, other than to say that I do want to acknowledge that this idea that human beings are playing an increasing role geologically in the biosphere and altering it in somewhat significant and permanent ways is really important to think about within the context of this work as well. But I'm focusing here more on animal death. So what I'm concerned about is how and where people do experience the deaths of other creatures within their own life worlds and contexts, the various ways in which we make meaning of those experiences. So my research is both phenomenological and hermeneutic, and I speak about what brought me to this work as a way of bracketing my own narrative and assumptions as best I can in order to engage more fully with the accounts of others. I see this as a matter of ethical and pedagogical importance. So I ask questions like, how can we as educators, or as environmentalists, or as human beings, cope with the number of deaths and losses that occur at all scales of our living communities? Without some understanding of what it is like to experience such phenomena, whether directly, indirectly, or symbolically. I'm perhaps most interested in children's experiences because of my educational background. Teaching children about, the polar bears going extinct, or teaching children about road ecology at the Toronto Zoo, and how, huge numbers of turtles and all kinds of animals are run over on roads every single day. Talking about threats is also part of what I'm also influenced by Richard Louv's work in Last Child in the Woods and his idea of nature deficit disorder. And I remember speaking once with an environmental education scholar, Philip Payne, about how we constantly frame ecology in terms of loss. And he suggested that what we present in EE is an educational model built on deficiencies. That we are teaching children about what they are losing or what has already been lost before we teach them how to love or appreciate what they actually see around them. So this deficiency even trickles down into who and how children are now when we see them written about as experientially troubled or problematic, as in Last Child in the Woods. So Richard Louv argues that children are suffering from, quote, nature deficit disorder. And I'm less interested in whether or not Louv is correct in this assertion, and he's done a thorough job of connecting statistics around obesity, sedentary behavior, poor concentration, and academic performance to time spent in the outdoors. But I'm more concerned about what it means to suggest that children of current generations are somehow less than experientially children of previous generations. That children now are not as knowledgeable, not as aware, not as connected to nature as children of some kind of past. So how far back do we go to find what is ideal in a child-nature relationship? And why do we emphasize the importance of some vision of healthy bodies or good test scores over happy, connected, sustainable relationships between human beings and multi-species environments? And I also am wondering about children's voices and children's experiences. For me, in as much as I can within the ways that I do my research, I conduct research interviews, and I do a lot of content analysis of various curriculum materials. I am interested in children's own voices and their own representations of their own experiences. So as you'll see later in the presentation, I'm actually going to share some audio clips with you of the children speaking about their own experiences. Because I think it's important to forefront their own ideas and voices rather than to constantly be adults that are speaking for them, although we certainly do that regardless. So some about my research trajectories. I'm interested in probably four different main themes. The first being how children themselves experience animal otherness within their worlds. The second being the wider implications of childhood experiences with animal death in terms of conservation, sustainability, and social and ecological justice. The third being where and in what ways educators, and here I use the term educators broadly because myself as a researcher, I'm actually engaging in a pedagogical relationship when I interview children, I believe, because I'm helping them to think through and re-articulate and remember experiences that they've already had. But how do educators frame the discursive and material realities of ecological loss, animal death, natural deficiencies, or other multi-species challenges? And then how do children's own experiences connect to the curricula that surround them in various educational spaces, whether that's zoos, schools, nature centers, media, the internet, peer groups, or even just in their homes? So there are several thinkers about childhood that I'd like to that I do draw upon. I'm only going to mention a couple of them here. The first I want to sort of touch upon is Yuri Bronfenbrenner. Perhaps the most relevant concept from Bronfenbrenner's work is his model of childhood as situated within various social ecological realms. So his ecological systems theory of child development, which you should be able to see now.
Yeah.
Bronfenbrenner demonstrates that child development occurs within and between these different sort of geographical and ecological places, from the microcosm of the individual or the mother-infant dyad from John Bowlby's attachment theory, to the microsystem of families, peer groups, schools, doctors, churches, all the way out to the macrosystem, which includes legal institutions, the media, political realms, cultural institutions, and larger ideologies of culture within which children are situated. And so what I find most useful about Bronfenbrenner's work is that it is environmental in its scope, and it can be adapted to consider various historical and cultural realities when looking at not only individual children, but the very concept of childhood. So whether that concept of childhood comes from Western periods of importance like Romanticism, or modern trends like children being little scientists or little theorists, or what Richard Lewis points out as the modern ideas of stranger danger and protectionism, and then also in looking at other cultures' attitudes and ideas about children in the environment, or in their development. But within the field of environmental education, many have argued that there is a lack in thinking through the more than human elements of this model. And so I looked to the work of others. I'll just name a couple people: Amy Carter-McKenzie, Veronica Pacini-Ketchebaugh, Africa Taylor, and there's a lot of other people who have begun to sort of piece together arguably a systems theory that involves the more than human world and a new kind of human-animal nature patchwork. The second theorist I just want to briefly touch upon is Catherine Nelson, whose work also establishes a system-based model of childhood that's rooted in children's unique experiential capacities. She talks about their development as part of their ongoing and increasing participation in socio-cultural communities, and I would also add to this probably ecological communities. For Nelson, linguistic development and cognitive development occur simultaneously as children seek inclusion in the world around them. She refers to children as experiential in a phenomenological sense. That is, she highlights that children perceive the world in unique ways, that they seek to incorporate experiences into their ongoing sense of self as being, as having a narrative or a story, and their sense of self as relational. She says that children are embedded within cultural and linguistic contexts where meaning is constantly being negotiated. They are learning to interpret the world for themselves, but are also constantly being taught by others to interpret the world in particular ways. And so cognitive and schematic dissonance often occurs, and how children mediate those moments of confusion or dissonance is important. So for my own purposes, I look at children as they are coming to understand their relationships with non-human beings and nature as embedded within these socio-cultural contexts. including language and larger ideological structures, but also as a matter of non-human agency, subjectivity, or materiality. So I try to consider as best as I can, given that most of the animals that I've talked with children about are dead, how those animals actually do shape children's development. So my research trajectory has taken on this sort of same systems-based model as I work from the inside out. I'll talk about my first research project in this kind of larger trajectory, which is my dissertation work, which is children's experiences of companion animal death. I was really interested in the home space as the sort of most prominent place where children begin to learn about and think about and explore meanings around their relationships with wider ecologies and with non-human beings. So many children, if you think about it, and I used to have the statistics somewhere, are born into homes where pets are already present. Almost all of the children that I interviewed for my project were born and there was a pet already present in the house. Some of the parents that I interviewed talked about this as being a way to test out their relationships with their significant other, to see if they could agree upon caregiving strategies before actually diving into the world of having children, which was an interesting finding, one that I didn't really report on too much. But so the presences of animals begin for these children at birth. And I was curious about how their experiences of the death of those animals, what impact those had on them, what ways that they made meaning, with whom did they sort of explore these meanings, and what are the larger ecological implications of those experiences. So obviously right now I don't have the time to sort of go into all of the findings of my dissertation, but I will touch upon two themes that emerged from my analysis that I think are important for this conversation today. The first being that death is inherent in life. And so the children I interviewed were between ages 8 to 12. There's a lot of significant reasons why I chose that age range, but from the developmental literature, a lot of researchers suggest that this is when children begin to really understand what death is and that it has implications in wider spheres. And since that was what I was interested in, I chose this age. So these children were able to express that death is an inherent part of life, that it's natural, that it's an ecological event that can also be tied to morality. And often they tied death to morality through different expressions of time and temporality. So I'll give you an example. So some of the children described animals as having natural lifetimes, even pets, that you would expect a guinea pig to live 5 years, maybe maximum, but you would expect a cat to live about 15 years. And how that was often tied to morality was their idea that it was right and just if an animal lived to its full lifetime before dying. They also tied this to temporality and morality together by thinking about the length of animal suffering. And so this was often a way for children to express the need for things like euthanasia, because euthanasia allows them as a family to decide that an animal doesn't deserve to suffer for any long period of time, and so ending its suffering early was the right thing to do. But throughout all of these expressions of tying temporality and morality together was the idea that death is an inherent part of life. So I'm going to play you a quick clip from one of the research participants, 10-year-old Adele, who's expressing this sentiment.
Death is.
Oops. And this is me.
What does that mean to you?
To me, death just makes me think about it stop living.
Yeah. And what happens afterward?
Well, I don't really know.
Yeah.
I don't really believe in heaven or hell or stuff because I kind of find it strange that you would die and then go somewhere else. And if there was such thing as heaven or hell, then it would constantly be expanding. So then I just see kind of like putting a bird in the ground, like just dropping it and covering it in dirt.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there's different ways, I guess, that you can do it. No,
I really want to try and find some biodegradable box.
Yeah.
That way, after maybe a little while, she can become part of the earth.
Yeah.
So, there's obviously a lot going on in here, but I wanted to show you that, or play you that clip because to me, one of the things, at least, that Adele is touching upon is this idea that death is natural, that death doesn't need to be explained away for her religious beliefs, although certainly many people do convey meaning to death through an understanding of religion or cultural beliefs like that. But she was tying it to more of an ecological sensibility of bodies being decomposed, providing new room for new species or new animals to emerge, to live, and that those things were tied to a sort of moral sense of goodness or rightness. The second theme that I wanted to touch upon is that experiences of death are continuous, and that our understanding of experiences of death and the ways in which we interpret them and make meaning of them shift over time as we develop more experiences. And this is tied to John Dewey's idea that experience is continuous, that each experience is related to previous and future experiences. And so I will play you another clip. And this is 12-year-old Christina talking about two sets of hermit crabs that died. Just give me a second to...
Okay, so
to find it first.
Some had bladder fever and some had belly fever there.
yeah. Was that your chore, or was that just something you did from time to time?
That was just something that Mommy asked me to do from time to time.
Oh, that's the wrong... Sorry. That was the wrong interview. There we go.
That was like actually a gift from one of my mom's students for her, but I took them.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I and my brother named one Thunder and I named the other one Bubbles.
Yeah.
And they were like really small hermit crabs. And I remember like I was too scared to actually like hold them.
Yeah.
And then they died. And then I got new ones. And but they were like, the new ones I got were like really big.
Yeah.
Like I got 3 like really big ones. And like I was full blown to like a little bit.
When was this?
Last year.
Last year. Last year. I don't remember what you have to do to take care of her.
You have to like change the water every day and like change their food every day.
Yeah.
I usually, and then like I sometimes give them like fruit or like some vegetables for them to eat. But mostly I just give them like some pellets. And you can, yeah. And you have to like spray their food like 2 times.
Oh, yeah.
They like, yeah, they like it more.
And when they died, do you remember what you talked about that?
Well, the first one, like I was really sad, but the second one I wasn't really surprised because like my other ones died too.
Yeah.
But like the second one's really gross because I went to pick up the shell and like the body just came out of the shell, so it was really gross.
But I stopped the presentation there, but she also began to talk about how she buried the second one in her mom's potted plants around the house, and they began to stink up the house. And she talked about how she learned about decomposition in dead bodies from that whole experience, even though she got in trouble. But I bring up these points in particular because to me they highlight the very complex ways that children think about and experience animal death. Piaget writes about death that it is the fortuitous and mysterious phenomenon par excellence. For Piaget, development leads children away from artificial thinking about causality and toward a recognition that death is a biological fact tied to chance in the world. And current research on children's concepts of death uphold this, suggesting that educators and parents and counselors would do well to avoid allowing children to reason about death as anything other than the cessation of life, biological and internal failure of the body, and a process made from artificial intentions. That is, God doesn't necessarily cause you to die, or human beings don't cause you to die. That death is the cessation of your bodily function. But as Silverberg points out, the human beings are often agents of death. And as she acknowledges, man-made mass death is often the process that lurks behind individual death and species-level losses, even if the cessation of biological function is the ultimate cause of death. So interestingly enough, during this research project for my dissertation, I received a lot of questions and concerns about how I was connecting companion animals to wider ecological or environmental issues. And I've argued in several places that companion animals are often considered troublesome, partly because they blur the boundaries of nature and culture that we often hold so rigidly. And as Donna Haraway's work acknowledges, however, companion animals, or as she often calls them, companion species, are historically and materially intertwined with human beings, that they trouble all sorts of categories that we rely on to articulate knowledge about animals and our ethical treatment of them. So several themes in this project drew on ecological concepts that were clearly articulated by children, and including the ways in which bodies are a part of ecological process, the blurry lines between home spaces and outside spaces, the centrality of relationships in our lives, the messiness of relationality within multi-species communities. These are some of the implications that I spoke about in a recent article that came out, that death entails a natural rhythm of life and death, that death is perceived as a relational event with wider ecological implications, and that death is part of being embodied or as having a body, and that bodies are connected to other bodies and to larger ecological systems. My current research has taken a slight turn to thinking about and working with children who hunt and fish. And we are finding that much of the meaning-making activities are still situated largely within families and home spaces, even if the activities themselves take place outside of the home in so-called wild areas. My research team and I have begun to emphasize the experiences of children who hunt or fish, in part because of the sheer numbers in the United States and Canada of wildlife recreationists. Upwards of 50 to 60 billion people, or 50 to 60 million people across both countries engage in hunting every year or fishing every year. And these involve family life in areas around the home. And so within the extensionist model that I'm using, this was one of several possibilities. But two students who approached me my first year teaching here at Canisius were young women who grew up hunting and fishing with their fathers, so that was the project we took on next. The research also comes at a good time, as CGEE recently saw a publication by Pontius, Greenwood, Ryan, and Greenwood on hunting and ecological learning. And I'm currently employed in a department that places a large emphasis on conservation. And in the United States, the Pittman and Robertson Act was passed in 1972, I believe, which declares that all sales of guns, ammunition, and a few other kinds of materials are taxed for contribution to wildlife conservation and ecological conservation. And in Canada, there's similar processes. Hunting stamps, conservation stamps, and other mechanisms actually allow hunters and anglers to contribute to wildlife conservation. They are the largest group of contributors to wildlife conservation in North America. So it's important to begin to think about those children's experiences as well. So far in our research project, we've spent a good deal of time engaging with various media sources aimed at children who hunt or fish, educational programs that teach children about hunting and fishing, children's own written stories or poetry about hunting and fishing, and several initial interviews, including an interview with 13-year-old Ray, who you see here, who is a passionate angler, who even teaches other children in his neighborhood to fish. And so thematically at this point, there's a lot of emerging themes that we're exploring. I don't want to touch too specifically on any of those until we have finished collecting some of the data, but I'll point to some of the variety of ways in which children are exposed to hunting and fishing as activities that have conservation, wildlife management, ecological, and even moral implications. The first that we're looking at is hunter education programs. In both Ontario and New York State, children of certain ages who wish to partake in hunting are required to take these hunter education courses. Typically in both places, children need to be about 16 years old to get a hunter permit, although apprentice permits or junior permits are available to children ages 12 and older. But they do all have to pass these education programs. And so in our reviews, a lot of it, as you might imagine, is about gun safety or bow and arrow safety. But there is quite a bit of time spent on teaching children ecological concepts, the ecological importance of hunting as a wildlife management strategy, about hunting and fishing as part of American or Canadian identity and history, as well as about wildlife identification and even hunting ethics. So the best way to shoot a deer or the best way to unhook a fish and to kill it so that it doesn't suffer. So we've been looking at, and actually my students are enrolling in and taking these hunter education courses online, which they're finding an interesting process. We're also looking at children's magazines and other media, and we're also looking at YouTube videos. There are actually many hundreds of YouTube videos documenting children's first time hunting. The girl you see on the screen is 9-year-old Savannah. Her video went viral, I'd say a couple of years ago. She was 9 years old and her father took her out deer hunting, and you can go on YouTube. I was going to show it to you, but I don't think we're going to have enough time. But there's a lot of data in these types of shared videos, and including in what the intentions of parents are in documenting these kinds of events and sharing them with wider communities. And then obviously the last point that we're engaging in is interviews. Children have in each interview discussed several themes that I'll just briefly introduce. They describe hunting and fishing as involving unique skill sets and knowledge sets. They describe them as requiring an understanding of other animals' perceptual world. They often describe them as requiring some emotional types of skills, including how to deal with boredom. Most of the kids have talked about hunting and fishing as largely boring activities that involve a lot of patience before anything exciting happens. But they also talk about the emotional components of killing an animal. And that clearly hunting and fishing as experiences are important to children because they're very social. All of these children talk about the importance of going out and hunting with their parents or fishing with their parents, typically fathers, although sometimes I have interviewed some children that go out hunting or fishing with their mothers as well. And so there are ethical, gender, all kinds of emotional components to those interviews that we're exploring now. I'll just briefly touch upon the future, and then I'm going to conclude with some implications, just a couple brief implications of this work. In the future, we have discussed looking at agriculture and children's relationships with agricultural animals and the death of agricultural animals. I have one research student who's currently beginning to look at roadkill and cultures that have emerged within the northeastern United States and parts of Canada around roadkill, which includes roadkill cafe and what are called vulture culture. I don't know if you've heard of vulture culture, but apparently large groups of people who collect roadkill and then taxidermy it or use the meat. And so we've begun looking at that as well. But I'm also interested in work with children and captive animals, and I'm currently engaging in some research at the local zoo with preschool children and the ways that they're learning about animals in the preschool. It's a zoo-based preschool. And then down the road, we're interested in looking at larger ecological narratives and pedagogical approaches that entail loss and death. I'm interested in longitudinal research, potentially interviewing children later on that I've interviewed before. And I'm also interested in educators' ideas about teaching children about death, endangerment, extinction, and the ecological crises. So, some of the implications, and I'll just briefly touch on these. The first is, as I mentioned, most of the animals that I'm talking to children about are already passed away or dead. But it's clear in all of this work that children often learn from animals, that animals are in some sense teachers, that animals are educational agents that teach children through the embodied encounter about animality, ecology, ethology, and more. Obviously, a significant number of these animals are dead, but certainly the narratives emerge from this research indicating how children understand animals as subjective creatures with radically different umwelts, who are both similar to and different from themselves. Children often express a lot of ambivalence about articulating animals' experiential life worlds. So on the one hand, they'll speak for animals nonchalantly, saying that their animals think this or their animals think of them certain ways. But on the other hand, when I ask them direct questions about what animals experience, most of them expresses a certain degree of uncertainty about really being able to understand an animal's point of view. Children's experiences with animals teach them that the other is never fully known or knowable, although clearly there are times where an effort to understand or live with that being is made regardless of that sort of gap. And the last point I want to make is that animal death in childhood is a common significant event, and that there are all kinds of different animal deaths that children experience. These are articulated in various ways, and children are engaged with related themes through a variety of curricula and media. How children interpret their own relationship to the more than human world and the role of death is existentially significant. These children are often asking questions about who they are, expressing anxieties about their roles in multi-species communities. These are extremely emotionally rich descriptions. They're ethically profound. And so this research trajectory is only really beginning to paint a larger picture about the various geographies of child-animal nature interaction and the discursive and material elements that shape their relationships. I think there are profound implications here for thinking through the many pedagogical endeavors that might be termed environmental education, science education, sustainability education, or humane education. And so my hope is that the research works to centralize some thoughts and experiences that children themselves have so as to establish a working knowledge of complex ways that they relate to the wider worlds of which they are a part. I believe my research demonstrates the need, too, to continue building a multi-species, multi-geography model of ecological systems theory and to provide culturally sensitive readings that are inclusive of non-human actors. So I'm continuing in this vein, hoping to draw out various existential and ecological components that are central to children's development, as well as adults' ideas, attitudes, values, and beliefs about the more than human world, so as to consider new ways of promoting living well in multi-species communities.